how these items were made, where they come from, what they've been up to over the course of their lives. But they will conveniently skip over one story from the Stone of Destiny's history. That's pretty interesting. So interesting that it's actually been made into a film. Okay? Now that story is something I'm going to tell you about here. And it's basically the story of the Stone of Destiny's holiday to Scotland in the year 1950. But we're not yet ready for it. We have to sort of rewind the clocks a little bit and do just a small amount of history. Okay? Now we're going to pick up where we left off at the castle. When we left off at the castle, it was year 1314. Robert the Bruce and his men, they were winning back the castles of Scotland. And are quite successful at this. Now, over the years to come, Robert the Bruce and his men would have some pretty good battles on battlefields and at the castles, but even still, they wouldn't actually get that much closer to getting independence for Scotland. Now, remember in 1296, Edward I and his men, they'd come to Scotland, they'd taken the crown jewels and the Stone of Destiny down to London. And these items would actually become part of the English coronation ceremony down in London. And the Stone of Destiny would become part of the English coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. So this would make the Scots pretty angry. This is why it was so important to fight for it, because if they didn't win it back, English bums would be crowned atop the Scots stone, and that would make them pretty angry. Anyway, by the year 1320, Robert the Bruce and his men were quite old, quite tired, really not able to handle the physical demands of fighting anymore. So they decided to change their approach. And Robert the Bruce and the noblest minds of Scotland sat together at a place called Arbroath Abbey, which is north of Edinburgh. They sat down around a big table, and there they began to pen a letter to the Pope. Now, back in the 14th century, the Pope was basically the United Nations. He was the only person the Scots could go to complain about the English. So, they sat down and wrote a letter that would in later years become known as the Declaration of Arbroath. Now, this letter is basically, it's really long, and it's written in Old Scots, and because of its length and because of its language, I'm going to paraphrase it for you. It basically said this: "Dear Mr. Pope, please tell the English to leave us alone. As long as there are but 100 of us alive, we will never surrender to them. But please tell them to give us our stuff back. Hugs and kisses, the Scots." They then sealed it up and sent it down to the Pope, but because the Pope was basically the United Nations, he got a lot of mail. So much mail that it would take him 8 years to reply to the Scots' request. Now eventually the Scots would get their letter back, and they'd be delighted to find the Pope had granted both their wishes. The Pope said, "Yes, I will tell the English to leave you alone, and yes, I will tell them to give you your stuff back." Sweet. So the Scots kicked up their feet and they thought, any day, our Stone of Destiny is going to be on our doorstep. Awesome. But it wasn't the case. You see, what they didn't know at the time is that it would be almost 700 years before the Stone of Destiny would return to Scotland. And if you're any good at math, that means that the Stone of Destiny is still yet to return here. Well, that's not true. It came back here officially in the year 1996, but it will come back here on holiday in the year 1950, and that's a pretty good story. Now, in 1950, there was a guy called Ian Hamilton. He was a Glasgow University law student, and he was also a very proud nationalist. Now, he had a lifelong dream. His lifelong dream was to bring the Stone of Destiny back to Scotland. And he thought that Christmas time of 1950 was a perfect time to make this happen. So he went to his fellow nationalist buddies, his also his law student friends, and he asked them for help in retrieving the Stone of Destiny from Westminster Abbey, and they were more than happy to help him out. Now, in the end, 4 people would make their way down to London to Westminster Abbey. They were Ian, Ellen, Gavin, and their female librarian called Kay. Now, these 4 people would take 2 Fords down to London, and when they got there, they would decide that they were going to break in on Christmas Eve. Perfect. Now, on Christmas Eve, when the boys were set to break, or when the kids were set to break into the Abbey, Kay, their female librarian and getaway driver, she wasn't feeling well, so they left her at a hotel. And the 3 men went to the Abbey, searched around for a way to get into it. Now, what they found is that one of the doors of Westminster Abbey that day was under construction, and therefore made of pine. Most of the doors are made of oak, so it's a very lucky find. They knew that pine was much easier to break through, so they broke through that door, had a peek around, and decided that tonight, Christmas Eve, was definitely the night. The boys returned to the hotel, told Kay what they'd done, and said, "Kay, meet us at the Abbey in an hour's time. We'll be ready for you." They returned to the Abbey, then walked in through the pine door, then walked past the tomb of Edward I, and decided at that point to do what Edward I had not done all those years earlier in Scotland. They were going to respect the throne. All they wanted was their Stone of Destiny. What they felt was rightfully theirs. So the men walked up to the Stone of Destiny, as we know, part of the English coronation chair. They put their hands on the iron ring and they began to pull. But it's at this point they realized that they'd made a pretty major oversight. The Stone of Destiny weighs about 400 pounds. It's about this big. And these were 3 very scrawny law students. They pulled and pulled and pulled, but they couldn't get the stone free. Eventually, the three men stood behind the chair and rocked it back and forth as the stone slowly slid out. But they were not fast enough or strong enough to catch the stone before it hit the ground. And when the Stone of Destiny, the symbol of Scottish independence, hit the ground of the floor of Westminster Abbey, it broke into two pieces. One of these about 250 pounds, the other about 150 pounds. Ian was so frustrated by this that he threw off his coat. But his friends Alan and Gavin were very quick thinkers. They moved the coat to the bigger piece of stone, then lifted that 250-pound stone just high enough to get onto the jacket, and then began to drag the Stone of Destiny on the length of Westminster Abbey. Now, if you've been to Westminster Abbey, you will know it's not a tiny place. These guys had quite a journey in front of them. But Ian had the exact same journey with nothing but his hands. He grabbed the smaller piece of stone, still 150 pounds, and he made a run for it. Now, he would eventually make it to the end of the Abbey, where he'd open the door and see that Kay, the getaway driver, was right on time. He'd race out to Kay's car, sit down alongside her, and explain to her what had happened. But as he told her the story, a guard approached the vehicle, knocked on the window, and asked them what these two young people were doing in the car park of Westminster Abbey on Christmas Eve. And Ian explained that they were just two young kids looking for a safe place to be alone together on Christmas Eve. And the guard actually had no problems with this. The guard said, "Do you know what, guys? That's lovely. There's a car park around the corner. If you go over there, I'll make sure you have all the privacy you need. I'm not going to bother you, and nobody else will." Well, that's convenient, because that's where their other car is. So, okay, well, think about it, but they can't leave the guard just yet, because their friends, Alan and Gavin, are trapped inside the Abbey. So they continue talking to this guard. Eventually, Alan and Gavin reach the door. They open the door, they see Ian and Kay, and they see the guard, and they flee. They go to a coffee shop in the centre of London, a place to meet should the group get separated. Ian sees this, gives him a few more minutes to get away, then thanks the officer for his help, reassures himself that he's going to get the privacy he needs, and then they drive off. They go to the other car park. Ian gets out of the car, and he wishes Kay good luck. He says, "Kay, take the Stone of Destiny anywhere. Just get it the hell out of London." And she drives off. He then goes to get in the other vehicle. And then he realizes something. He doesn't have the keys. Where are Ian's keys? Ian's keys are in Ian's jacket pocket, which is underneath the Stone of Destiny in Westminster Abbey, a half-mile away. He has no choice but to run back to the Abbey. He gets into the Abbey and he searches for his keys, but he cannot find them. He then uses the only light source he has, which is a book of matches, to light his way down the length of Westminster Abbey. Now, he eventually runs out of matches, but lucky for him, he still finds his keys when he accidentally steps on them. He's a very lucky guy. No time to think about what a shambles his operations become. He grabs the keys and he runs back to the other car park, picks up the car, comes back to Westminster Abbey, runs up to the Stone of Destiny, still 250 pounds, and with nothing but pure adrenaline manages to lift it just high enough to get it into his car. And he drives away from Westminster Abbey as the guards are coming to open the Abbey for Christmas morning mass. Now, he then goes to the coffee shop and picks up his two friends, and when the three men are reunited, they decide to drive to Kent. Now, Kent is just to the east of London. They think it's rural there, we can leave our stone in a field, and we'll come back and get it when we know the border to Scotland has not been closed. So they find a suitable field, make a map on a napkin, and then they begin their journey back up to Glasgow. Now, it takes about 3 days to make that journey. When they get there, they find that the border to Scotland has indeed been closed. They're searching every car that comes across that border. And also, all of the newspapers are offering reward money for any information about the missing Stone of Destiny. Now, all of Ian's friends know that he is responsible for this, but nobody is going to turn him in. And that's because nobody wants a Scotsman to be held responsible for this crime against the English. So it becomes a citywide and then countrywide secret for the next 4 months. And that is until Ian is put in touch with the councilman. And the councilman basically says, "Ian, it's all well and good that you've taken the Stone of Destiny, but it doesn't really do anybody any good. It's not in the hands of the Scottish people." A fair point. So Ian thanks him for his advice, returns to Glasgow, and this time he gets the big strong rugby players to help. Now, these guys help him go down to Kent. There are 4 in total. They make their way down to their field in Kent, and when they get there, they find the absolute worst thing they can imagine sitting on top of their Stone of Destiny. A gypsy caravan. But no ordinary gypsy caravan, it's a caravan of Irish gypsies. And the Irish and the Scots have a small thing in common. They don't really like the English. They're more than happy to move their caravan off of the stone. They even rip out the passenger seat of the boy's car and replace it with the Stone of Destiny. And then Ian Hamilton, our hero, is able to literally ride the Stone of Destiny back across the border into Glasgow. Now when he gets there, he has a celebratory dram of whiskey with the stone. And then he brings it to a stonemason to help reunite it with his other piece. Kay's piece had gone to Birmingham for a few days, and then she brought it directly up to Glasgow. And nobody searched her car because nobody thought this tiny librarian lady had the Stone of Destiny in her vehicle. Wrong. Anyway, once the Stone of Destiny was whole again, they brought it to the councilman, and the councilman helped them bring it to Arbroath Abbey, where the declaration of Arbroath had been written all those years earlier. In the middle of the night, they went into the abbey, put the stone on the abbey floor, and covered it in a saltire, which is the Scots flag. And the next morning, the guards came in to open the abbey. They saw a big lumpy thing under a blue flag, and without looking beneath it, they knew exactly what it was, and they called the police. And at that point, the Stone of Destiny, the symbol of Scottish independence that had been through so much and travelled so far, will begin its journey back down to London. And within less than 24 hours, will be part of the English coronation chair once again. So all the boys' efforts will be for nothing. But it's okay. Here's why it's okay. It's okay because the boys were never charged with anything. It's mainly because they kept their involvement secret for about 25 years, but also because nobody knows who the Stone of Destiny belongs to. By order of the Pope, the Stone of Destiny belongs to the Scots. But by order of the English and the rules that they just sort of made up, it belongs to them. Okay, so nobody's guilty of stealing from anybody else. But it's also okay because, as we know, the Stone of Destiny would eventually come back here to Scotland in 1996. Now, in 1996, they were preparing for an election here in Britain, and the Conservative leader at the time really wanted Scottish votes. Now, Scots aren't known for voting Conservative, so he knew he was going to need a really good offer. So he called up to Scotland and he said, "Hey, Scotland, if I give you that stone back, that stupid stone you're always going on about, then will you vote for me?" And the Scots said, "Send it up, we'll be in touch." Desperate for votes, the Conservatives would send it up. They'd stick true to their word. And the Stone of Destiny would be received by the Royal Guards on the Royal Mile. It would then be brought directly up to Edinburgh Castle. And as the Stone of Destiny made its journey up the Royal Mile, it was accompanied by a bagpipe band. But that band didn't play a song you'd expect to hear. There was no Scotland the Brave or Flower of Scotland. Instead, what they chose to play was a very fitting tribute, the theme song to Mission Impossible. They're classy people. Anyway, once the Stone of Destiny made it up here to Edinburgh Castle, it was put behind its glass box, and that's why you can see it there today. But I want you to know that while the Stone of Destiny is in Scotland now, it's not here permanently. It's actually only here on loan from the English. The next time there's a coronation down in London, they're going to borrow it back, and the Scots don't know if they're going to get the Stone of Destiny back right away. But they're also not that bothered about it because there have been some developments in Scottish independence since it returned in 1996. In 1997, when that election finally took place, the Conservatives didn't win. You probably knew that. Tony Blair and the Labour Party won. And that's partly because they were always going to, but also because they offered the Scots the only thing better than the symbol of Scottish independence. They offered actual independence. They offered Scotland their own parliament, in their first parliament in almost 300 years, 292 years. Now, the first new Scottish Parliament was held in 1999 at that building just up there with the two towers on it. Now, that building is the University of Edinburgh New College. It was held there for 5 years until the new Scottish Parliament building was finished being built in 2004. Now, the new Scottish Parliament building is at the very end of the Royal Mile, just opposite Holyrood Palace. It is a very modern and also very controversial building here in Edinburgh, but it's one of my favourites, so I definitely encourage you to check it out. If you go in there, guys, you can find a bit of history about the Scottish Parliament. You can also learn about the design used to make that really crazy looking building. Now, I'll also tell you guys, if you don't have time to get into Scottish Parliament, that's okay as well. The Scottish Parliament isn't actually in charge of all that much. They're in charge of things like tourism, education, and healthcare, but they're not even in charge of their own taxes. That's still the English. Now, there are some people in Scotland that do feel that England and Scotland need to be separate, but the vast majority of people, about 85%, aren't bothered. They're fine with the current state of things. They're fine being tied to the English. So the fact that the Parliament has has very few powers, that's fine. The fact that the Stone of Destiny's prophecy-making seals are kind of rubbish, that's fine too. But these things are also fine because I think the Scots do know that ultimately they will get the independence that they seek. And that's because there's something more powerful than a Stone of Destiny or Parliament, and that is nature. Okay, now, if you guys recall, when I started this 320 million years ago, I told you that Scotland was moving north. Well, Scotland is still moving north today, at about the rate that your fingernail grows every year. And while Scotland is moving to the north, England is moving to the west. And the scientists estimate that in about 25 million years' time, Scotland will break free from England. And at that point, the Scots will be able to wave goodbye to the English with whatever gesture they see fit across the newly formed Scots Channel. It'll be a glorious day for Scotland, and probably a pretty good one for England as well. It'll be a great day in world history, but unfortunately, none of us are going to be around to witness it. We can only hope that maybe somebody is around to maybe grab a photo of it or something like that. But on that note, guys, that is actually the history of Scotland and Edinburgh, its capital city, and even a tiny bit of the future's history. And that, guys, is all I've got for you today. That is the end of our tour. Yay!